Just while I get going here, to put Tom's figures from the new Housing Action Plan in context, last year the local authorities in Ireland built 7 houses a month. Under the new 7 houses a month, under the new Housing Action Plan, that's going to have to be ramped up to 513 houses a month. So there is that's only the social housing side of things. So there's a big task ahead, judging by the Housing Action Plan today. And and the same as Tom, I wish Simon Coveney all the best as well. In fairness, he has a good advisor there, a guy called Bob Jordan, who used to be the CEO of Threshold, which is a tenants' rights and advocacy organisation. And I wish them both very well. They have an uphill job. Anybody to ramp up from 7 houses a month to 513 houses a month across local authorities that have been decimated in terms of their staff numbers and their capability over the last 15 years. And with staff, of course, goes institutional memory. So they have a massive task ahead of them. Some of the parts of the Housing Action Plan I think could be better, and I think a lot of it is quite good. So I hope it all works out really well for them. Just before I put up the title, I found this picture of a house, because we're talking about housing, without realising that in the bottom left window there is a scary, evil person looking out. So I have a feeling this came from some sort of horror movie, so apologies for that. Maybe it's a legacy issue, Tom. I don't know what it is. But anyway, so what I wanted to talk about today is the things that we don't talk about when we talk about housing. Like when I knew that Tom was going to be on the same panel, I know the stuff that the CIF want to talk about, and generally you can tell people, which is great, because you need to have all that debate. But there are things that we don't talk about in housing that we should really talk about, and sometimes the things to do with housing are not in Simon Coveney's control. And that's a difficult one, because they get ministers of all colours. I don't really care what political party they are. They get it in the neck, and sometimes there are issues that aren't really the minister's fault, and there's little they can do about them when we come to those. So I thought we'd ask 3 what I think are pertinent questions about housing. Don't worry if you can't see it. I'm going to talk your way through it anyway, so don't panic. So the first question is about how much control does the state actually have over housing? So as Tom said, we've had numerous reports and plans, and we've had very little action. So a lot of the stuff to do with housing and our problems to do with housing are not necessarily around supply, but they're around demand. So if you didn't have demand, you wouldn't have a supply issue. So I want to talk about how much control the state has over our housing situation. Then I want to talk about the actual numbers of houses that we're building. Because, as Tom said, last year we built 12,666 houses. Or did we? So I'm going to show you some figures, and I was helped by the census figures that came out last Thursday. Actually, I was panicked by the census figures that came out last Thursday, because I had to rewrite everything. So when you look at this, the figures that you read in the headlines aren't necessarily the houses that you see on the ground. And we have a bit of an issue about that and about how we measure what we're building. And Tom's point about the vacancy rates, yeah, it's well made. There are vacancy issues around the country. Quite often they're in areas that aren't a problem, but there are also vacancy issues in Dublin. 9.7% vacancy rate, which is quite high. Kildare seems to be the only county that has a functioning vacancy rate of about 6%. And the last question then is about ownership of property. And I write a column in the Sunday Times every week about this, and last week I wrote about ownership. And I've been called something, I get abused for this obviously, I've been called something that I've never been called before, which is a neo-socialist. So there's a new, I have to work my way up to being a new neo-socialist. But all I was trying to do was address the issues of ownership, and that's what I want to do here at the last bit. It's just to talk about ownership. Ownership isn't clear-cut. It's not as straightforward as you own or you don't own. There are many facets to things like ownership. So the first question, how much state does the control really have? Well, I mean, demand is the issue. You don't have a supply problem unless you have a demand issue. So then you have to ask yourself, well, what are the real, is this mic okay? What are the real causes of demand? And when you go through the census figures and when you go through, issues around housing, you find that the biggest demand for housing is what's called the headship rate, the number of households being formed, and they're smaller households. So we have a huge amount of people now who are staying single for longer. The average age to get married in Ireland now is 34. The average age to get your first mortgage in Ireland now is also 34. You have about a third of all people will stay single forever. Okay, when you go think back to the 60s and 70s when everybody When my father was my age, I was probably going to university. You know, but nowadays, it's not like that anymore, and people are staying single for far longer. And when they stay single, they need houses, and what you have are people in individual houses on their own. And that's, of course, a housing, like, rather than sharing houses by getting married, or cohabiting, or whatever you want to call it, you have lots of single people. So on any street, on average, when you walk down the street, every third house will have one person, or every apartment will have one person living in it. Very hard for the government to control that. Family breakup, 9.7% separation rate in Ireland. So 9.7% of marriages break up. Is nothing compared to the UK or Spain, where half them break up. A massive cause of housing demand, because now you have a husband and wife who are happily married, or whatever they were, and now instead of having one house, they need two houses. Massive problem in places like Switzerland, which are really interesting to go to Switzerland, because housing is so expensive that when they separate, they can't afford to actually physically separate. So the house upstairs gets converted, the floor upstairs gets converted into an apartment for him, and the wife lives downstairs, or whatever way it works. But they end up living together. So that's it. Like, what can the government do about controlling people separating? Very little. Then you have empty nesters and people buying holiday homes and all that kind of stuff. So that's the biggest cause of housing demand out there, from a demographic perspective. The second one, I've got two question marks. That's the fun one, and I'm going to come back to that in a second in the next slide. The third biggest cause is population growth. Now, I missed Patrick this morning from the CSO, but I think 170,000 people in the last 5 years, something like 169,000 people. We built, well, for those 170,000 people, we added 19,000 houses to the stock. We'll come to that in a minute. So where they're going to live is going to be interesting. About 16,000 extra people are going to come in around the Dublin area in this year. 75% of population growth, I think, has been in urban areas, and half the population growth has been on the East Coast. So we know where the demand for housing is. And then the fourth biggest cause is the immediate demand, the lack of demand. And we have a problem, because we know where the immediate demand for housing is, because it's mostly on the East Coast and in the urban areas. Last year, 47.6, nearly half of all houses, and it's pretty consistent every year, were one-off houses built. So they're bespoke houses built for a particular client. They never reach the market anyway. So number two, the second biggest cause of housing demand is obsolescence. Houses falling out of use. Different to vacancy, okay? Obsolescence is houses falling out of use. On average, about 123 houses go obsolete every week in Ireland. Every week. That's down. Recently, it was 190 houses a week. It's down to 123 houses a week. So that's nearly 6,500 houses a year become obsolete in Ireland. That is a huge amount of houses. It's not all in rural areas either, before someone puts up their hand and says it's in Leitrim or whatever. It doesn't matter. It actually does matter, and a lot of it is in urban areas. And you'll see this when you walk around the large urban areas in Cork, in Limerick, in Galway and in Dublin. You'll see how many vacant, boarded up properties there are that you cannot... The drive from Ardra, I can never pronounce it properly, Ardra to here, the taxi man pointing out all the empty houses on the way, and it's only 9 kilometres. So this is endemic around the country. So this obsolescence is a serious issue around the place, and it's something that I think we need to tackle. So why do we have obsolescence? Now, these are the reasons that I can think of from my own perspective, from my own personal experience, and my experience with the countryside. My mum lives in Tipperary, so I'm up and down to Tipperary area a lot, and I see lovely towns, Feathert and Killinall and Coolmore, Stud and Horsey Country down there, and I can still see all this kind of stuff happening. The lovely town of Feathert has got so many empty properties and houses in it, it's shocking, and it's a really beautiful town, and not a poor town either, but there's a lot of stuff. So my experience, there are loads of other reasons that you might know as well. Neglect. Sometimes there's strategic neglect of properties, where people deliberately let a property cave in on itself in order to apply for planning permission to demolish it, all that. Fecklessness, one of my favourite words in the English language, just can't be bothered. People just can't have that house there, can't be bothered doing anything with it, and sure it's caved in, sure what can I do about it? Financial constraints, in other words, they can't afford to rehabilitate the building back into use. Too much money, lack of financial constraints, too much money, too much property. I don't need to do anything with it. I have no financial imperative to do this. Regulation changes can make a house obsolete. So you bring in new fire regulations or new universal access, and suddenly a house that would have got planning permission or would have been brought back into use can't now because it doesn't meet the new regulations. Family disputes over who owns the property or who will get what, and the property sits there and sits there and sits there. 10 years later, I have a friend who's a barrister who specialises in this, and he has made a load of money over the years dealing with the probate and the family disputes as houses fall down, not around people's ears because they're not living in them. And the countryside, you see, is full of this. And the lack of awareness. And you get that from, these are only the reasons that I'm familiar with, and you get that from people who might have inherited the property and now live in Canada or Australia, don't even know what they should be doing, what they're supposed to do with these. There are probably also loads of other reasons that I'm not aware of, but these are the reasons that I see why properties become obsolete. The problem with obsolescence and these things is, like, we make official policy on these statistics, and we're not taking account of this. So all policy that comes out is based on CSO statistics and the Department of Environment's quarterly returns from local authorities. And so we have issues around the veracity or otherwise of the statistic, or how much you can rely on them. So the official numbers are these. I'll call them out if you can't read them anyway. So the total number of houses that we completed, and the words, the devil is in the detail with these things, the total number of houses that we completed from 2011 to 2015 was just under 51,000 houses, or 10,200 a year. That's on average what we did, 10,200 houses a year. However, the census, the CSO, said that we only added about 19,000 houses to our housing stock, or 3,700 a year. So if we built 51,000, we only added 19,000, where did the rest of them go? Okay? So we have this issue where we're down. So the 18,981 houses that we added to our housing stock is less than 1%. So in 5 years, we added less than 1%. To put that in context, in 2006, we added 21.7%. 2011, we added about 13%. And this year, we added 0.94%. Or in the last 5 years, we added 0.94%. So we're kind of at housing standstill, really. So when you look at the obsolescence, which is, I had a discussion with the CSO about this, about the missing 32,000 houses, and obsolescence would seem to be the reason here. And it averages out at about 6,400 houses a year becoming obsolete. So when you put that figure into the official figures that we got, we pick a year. So 2015 is the year I'm familiar with. The total number of completions, as Tom said, was 12,666, and half those were one-off houses. It doesn't matter for the purposes of this. 12,666. I'm just doing the middle column here for those of you that are following it. Take away the obsolescence, average obsolescence of nearly 6,400 houses a year. We're actually only added 6,282 houses to our housing stock out of that 12,500. This is why we're adding very, very little. Now, as a percentage of housing need, okay, so there are different schools of thought out there. Some people say we need 25,000 houses a year. Some people say, as Tom said, we need 30,000. I say we need 40, and actually, if not 50, okay? If we take it, and the reason is, a lot of the estimates around 25 and 30,000 are based on studies of urban areas. So they're looking at urban need. Now, urban, in the context of these studies, also means towns and villages. But they're excluding anything outside a village, and there are strict definitions of what is a village. But if you take it, the ESRI are saying we need 25,000 houses, well then we're just about annually meeting a quarter of that need every year. Okay, we're nowhere at the races. If you take my figure of 40,000, then we're meeting about 15%. So we're between 15 and 25% of our annual housing need is what we're meeting. So we have a long, long way to go. And this is just, so we've got work to do. Then on the right, the column on the right, I've called the ESB factor. Because we measure housing completions by the connection to the ESB grid. Okay. Now that brings up lots of issues. And there's a margin, which I'll go through now in a second. There's a margin of error there that the Society of Chartered Surveyors Ireland have identified of around 20%. Okay. So just because you're connected to the grid doesn't mean you have a new house. Okay. And that's where they're going with this. If you take off the 20% margin of error from the ESB, and then you take off your obsolescence, we're down to less than 4,000 houses a year. Okay, so that's about 15% of the ESRI's estimate of 25,000 houses a year, or less than 10% of my estimate of nearly 40,000 houses a year. So the figures that we get in the headlines when you read the newspapers and when you see the press releases, what we have failed to do over the years is account for all the houses that are falling out of use and falling out of stock for all those reasons that I mentioned earlier on. So to get a true figure, it's like going from your gross to your net. And we've been very bad at that. We've been good at taking the headline figures, but when you drill down into them, they paint an even worse picture, unfortunately, than we've come to expect. So don't worry about this graph. It's not madly complicated, but it looks more than it is. The blue line is what we've built over the last 15 years. You can see it going down, down, down. The yellow line is the additional stock, so that difference between what we build and what we've actually added to the stock. The red one, and I'll show you a better one in a second, the red one is the really interesting one. The arrow going up is the percentage of obsolescence, the number of a percentage of obsolescence as a percentage of the additional stock. So, if I just put this in context here, this is the red one, the red sections are the one to look at here. In 2006, for every 100 houses that we built, we lost 8 houses through obsolescence. Okay? In 2011, the middle one, for every 100 houses we built, we lost 14 houses through obsolescence. 2016, you can see it's getting a bit kind of panicky here. In 2016, for every 100 houses, we lost 63 through obsolescence. Okay? So, as a proportion of the houses that we build. Okay? So that's serious. That means we have an issue around management of our stock. We also have issues around measurement, because the figures that you will see coming from the department, the CSO, are the figures. The figures that you see come from the department, and they're doing nothing wrong. I'm not having a go with the department. They don't like me enough already, but I'm having another go with them. But the figures, they are recording the numbers that they get in from the local authorities. They're doing absolutely nothing wrong, and they're available in an Excel spreadsheet on environ.ie, and everybody go and have a look at them. But we do have issues measuring our housing stock. So a lot of it's not just about building, and obviously we need to build, and Tom's guys need to get out there and get working, and we need to build, but we also need to maintain the stock that we have, and we're not good at that. We've been a little bit careless about looking after the housing stock that we already have. The factors around obsolescence we need to look at. How can it be that someone can own properties and just let them go to rack and ruin? We shouldn't really be allowing that to happen in a country that has a housing crisis. There is always a use for a property. If it's in rural Tipperary, if it's in Glenties, if it's in Cabra, wherever it is, there is always a use for a property. We have more knowledge about every cow, sheep and pig in Ireland, where it was born, where it was raised, where it was transported and where it was slaughtered, than we do about our housing in Ireland. And that's wrong. Housing people are far more important to me than cattle, sheep and pigs. And we should be able to measure what we do much, much better. Then there's the ESB factor. As Tom said, the completions are measured by connection to the grid, but there's loads of reasons why you could connect to the grid without building a new house. You could need a temporary connection if you're getting works done. If you converted a granny flat or a garage into a granny flat and gave the granny a new ESB connection, it's not a new unit, it's the same house. There are lots of reasons why you can have a connection that doesn't necessarily equate to a new property, which is why the Society of Chartered Surveyors use this 20% margin of error. And of course all this has public policy implications, because look at today, our housing action plan today that we've produced will be based on those numbers of 51,000. They won't be based on the CSO ones, because they only come out on Thursday or Wednesday. So they're going to be based on department returns, which kind of paints a slightly rosier picture than we're getting. So the 25,000 houses a year that the Minister said in the Housing Action Plan that they're going to get, I think that could nearly be doubled. Because really, if you're losing 6,500 houses a year, to get an additional 25,000, you need to be building 31,500 houses if you want to add 25,000 to the housing stock. So that's a kind of a serious issue we have with measurement. Okay, if you were a minister, if I was Minister Coveney, or if I was advising Minister Coveney, what should be a state response to this? Well, obviously, without a doubt, supply. We need to build houses. There aren't enough units out there for people to live, and I absolutely would support that. You need to get building and build lots of houses in places where they're needed, of the right type, etc., and all that. But the other thing that I think that we neglect, and the housing agency, I think, are pretty good at this, but is we do need to be better at managing the housing stock that we have. And if you think about the vacancy issue, for example, when the enumerators were doing the census, when they find an empty house, they have no way of knowing who owns the house or what the status of the house is. So they have to go knocking on the neighbouring houses. That is no way to form an official statistic for your house for your state on which you're going to form public policy. Knocking on neighbours' doors, who will give you a speculative answer or no answer or whatever answer they want, and that goes down on the form. And so who knows what the status of the house is. So we have an issue around all that. So we're not good at managing the stock that we have. And there's definitely, obviously there's a stream of new housing that's needed, but we could be much better at managing the houses that we have. Of course, all the houses that we have that are becoming obsolete are owned by people. There are owners for all of these. We don't know where they are. We don't even know who they are sometimes. So if you start to manage properties that are already in existence, you're into this idea of challenging ownership, or at least confronting the concept of ownership, because I'm trying to tell somebody what they can or cannot do with their property, or what they should or should not do with their property. And it's a brave politician that comes up to challenge ownership in Ireland. It's not an issue in many other countries. I was writing last week in the paper about, in America, do not trespass or you will be shot, and they actually mean it. And in Sweden, there's this allemansrätten thing where you can roam anywhere you want except someone's private garden, and nobody can stop you. In Ireland, we're closer to the "you will be shot" school, I think, rather than the kind of the school of anybody can roam anywhere. In England, they're kind of in between. But to deal with managing property, you're into this concept of challenging ownership. And ownership is really, really important to people, because it's been the root cause of so much social upheaval over the years. You have the Magna Carta, communism. This is all centred around property ownership. A lot of the power, like for years, for centuries, the right to vote. You could only vote if you were a property owner and a man, but a property owner as well. And so property ownership, the concept of ownership, is really, really, really important. So if we're going to manage property properly, it might be necessary to challenge these kind of concepts of ownership, and in there, of course, is taxation of land. Okay, because that's the biggest stick that you have in terms of ownership, about going from non-use into use. And the other thing about ownership, it's really difficult for the state to exercise control over housing and managing housing when everybody wants their own control. And you hear this from the flat earth brigade of various political parties who are away on the right wing, falling off the edge of the earth, saying, it's my property, I can do what I want with it, nobody has the right to tell me what to do with it. And you can't really manage a housing stock as a state if that's the attitude of the people who own properties in the country. So finally, if you're going to challenge ownership, we've got to ask how far we're going to go. So there are some questions that we could ask ourselves if we're going to do this. So for example, I presume most people here are property owners. I'm in the middle of buying a house myself at the moment, so I'm going through the central bank torture, where they want to know where my communion money was and all that kind of stuff, and it's very, very, very hard going. So it is. But anyway, so the questions that we have to ask, do property right owners really have the right to do what they want with their land? Do property, and what land, I mean housing and their building, as well. Do property owners have the right to do nothing with their land? Does somebody in beautiful town of Feathers in Tipperary have the right in the middle of the town to let a building fall in on itself, or go beyond habitable use? Maybe not dangerous because the council might step in, but just, the roof caved in, nobody could live there, the ESB is cut off. Does somebody have the right to do that in the middle of a housing shortage? Whether it's Feathered, whether it's Glenties, whether it's Cabra, or wherever it is. Who should be able to object to an owner doing something on their land? And that's something that the developers have issues with, in terms of the planning and the regulation process. When you lob in a planning application and some guy lobs an objection from Geneva and you're trying to build houses in Malahide. I mean, do people have a right to do that? These are questions to start the conversation. I mean, I have no say on this. If a person temporarily acquires a property to live in, what rights does the original owner retain? I'm thinking there about people who are renting. Because we've got a very landlord-centric rental system in Ireland that is not sustainable in the long term for our ageing population and 1/3 of the people in the country who will never own a property. You do not want to be a renter in Ireland in the way it's currently set up when you're pushing your 40s, 50s, 60s and so on. Do we need to own all of the property that we buy? Why can't I just buy the house and you keep the ground? And this is a concept, this is like going back to ground rents and ground building leases back in the 1700s in Dublin. But a colleague of mine, Brian Hughes, who's a demographer, has kind of reinvented this and is busy drafting a piece of legislation at the moment about this idea that you just buy the house and somebody, it could be the council, it could be the builder, it could be anybody who retains the actual land portion. So you're only paying for the property that you buy, the unit that you buy. And the killer one for me, and when I was discussing enumerators and census, it came to me, should property right owners have the right to remain anonymous? What happens when you can't find a property that's perfectly good or could be made perfectly good, but we don't know who owns it? And again, the people on the end, there's a lot of people who object to the idea of having a register, but yet we have, you have to register your principal primary residence for property tax, and also there's loads of databases, but yet the CSO doesn't seem to be able to access them to determine who owns the property that's there. So we have an issue about registration of ownership, and I think in registration of ownership, I would counter that by, or I would qualify that by saying beneficial ownership, because what happened in the UK when they tried to bring in this was that suddenly you had 36,000 companies being set up, shell companies. So, Grey Laptop Limited owns number 17 New Cabra Road, and nobody knows who the owner of that, because that company is in Cayman Islands. So you need the beneficial ownership if you're going to do that. Courts are much willing to go further with politicians in addressing these issues. I think politicians have been not very good at challenging ownership, and the vacant site levy, which we won't go into here, is a really good example of that. So these are some questions. So really, when we're talking about housing, and it's a big, broad debate, and we can have, we could have 20 of us on the stage here with different topics, I think we should think about three things when you hear the stats in the Housing Action Plan. What can we control and what can we not control? What's the real numbers rather than the headline figures? And then we need to have a debate about rights and obligations in regard to housing and the housing stock that we have. Okay, thank you very much for listening to that.